Hey y'all, my name's Emily Province, and I am a person who's living in the United States who's feeling concerned about the possibility of election violence. I think it's pretty likely that actually a fair number of you are also feeling concerned about the possibility of election violence. And I want to actually talk about it with you and talk about what we can do to prevent it. I've done a bunch of research. I didn't start out in this field as an expert. I'm probably still not exactly an expert, but the thing that I do fairly well is do research, gain an understanding, and figure out how to explain things to people. So I'm hoping you'll engage with a series of videos about election violence, what it is, what the causes tend to be, what we have learned from the expertise in other places, and then how we can apply this knowledge in our day-to-day lives in 2024. I've started hearing people talking about election violence and the possibility of election violence here. More specifically, I'm hearing our media start to talk about it, not in the sense of trying to encourage it, but usually in the sense of reflecting on the possibility that it might happen. And this is the case across the board. I'm hearing this in liberal-leaning media. I'm hearing this in conservative-leaning media, this idea of, are we worried about the possibility of election violence in this country? And here's the problem. When we start talking about election violence and we're feeling nervous about it, and our media is telling us that it might happen, but there is nothing in the conversation about what causes it or how we might prevent it, then we are normalizing the idea of election violence, and we are frightening people, and we are encouraging people to enter a blame cycle. It's that other side's fault. And none of this is actually helpful to the problem. When we're talking about election violence, what we need to talk about is what tends to cause it in our environment and what each person among us can do to prevent this from happening. There are real steps that we can take. One of the things that we can do is learn about the pre-existing expertise. There are folks who do this work internationally and have been doing this work internationally for decades. They know things. I want to talk to you about some of what international research and practice has learned. Also, there's ways we can think about this stuff. We can actually change our mindset, how we're going into it. And then there are certain very specific actions that we can take. Today, all I'm going to do is talk to you about a basic definition, understanding what election violence actually is, because it's a technical term. I didn't know that. I didn't realize that election violence refers to something specific by people who are practicing preventing violence of various kinds around the world. But here's what it means. The first thing it can be is physical violence. And that's pretty clear. Physical violence, meaning assassinations, meaning mass riots, meaning hand-on-hand or weapon-on-weapon kind of violence. A second possibility is severe psychological violence. And I want to talk about that because a lot of times in our country, we're talking about psychological violence as being things that happen when people say words to each other. And that is what this means, but it can actually elevate pretty far before we hit the definition of election violence. So this is not somebody yelling, this is not somebody swearing, this is not even in some cases hate speech. It becomes election violence at the point that it is severe and probably ongoing threats that are specifically intended to alter somebody's actions in relation to the election itself. And then the third possibility is destruction of property of either monetary or symbolic value. And some of us want to argue back with that point, like it's not really violence if it's property destruction. Actually, I agree with you. Property destruction at its nature probably isn't quite the same thing as violence. But the reason it's in this definition is because usually, historically, if somebody is destroying property in connection with an election, then physical violence against human life comes very soon thereafter. That's why we think about it as part of the same phenomenon. So it's physical violence or severe psychological violence or destruction of property of monetary or symbolic value if that is either motivated by an election cycle or intended to influence an election cycle. So think about that definition for a minute. And if you're really thinking about that definition, you realize that election violence can start many months before an election And it can also continue for months after an election. Election violence is not an election day issue. It can and sometimes does happen on election day, but it's not limited to that. So I want to give you a quick piece of bad news and then a quick piece of good news as we finish this video. Here's the bad news. People who are experts in this field, who think about election violence all the time and who have experience in preventing it in other countries, still cannot predict with any level of accuracy where it will happen, when it will happen, even whether it will happen. They can't tell you there's going to be violence in this city, but not that one, or there might be violence in the countryside, but there won't be violence in the town. It isn't like that. What they can do is tell us what some basic social patterns are, like what kinds of things tend to be happening in the country before violence happens. And I'll talk to you about some of those in an upcoming video. And then the other piece, here's the good news, is that there's actually hope. I have been having conversations with people across the political spectrum and from all kinds of different backgrounds and all over the United States, and asking them to talk to me about what do they think about the possibility of election violence in 2024, 2025. And the thing is, across the board, Republicans, Democrats, independents, no matter what political affiliation somebody has or doesn't have, most people do not want violence. Most people do not want violence, but a lot of them are really scared that the other side does. And so that's the piece of this that gives me hope. If we can actually believe enough to make connections across the aisle on this one point, not to compromise our politics. I'm not encouraging anybody to change opinions or beliefs about politics or morality. But if you can connect on this one thing, like, can we have the disagreement, but can we have it nonviolently? If we can work together on that one issue, then we are a huge majority of people in this country who do not want violence in the connection with the election, and we can actually do something about it. More on this on another day.